Hi guys, as promised, I'm here today with a discussion on Jane Eyre. I hosted a read-along of Jane Eyre during the first 2 weeks of April, so if you took part in that, welcome, take a seat. If you didn't take part in that and you want to listen to my thoughts on Jane Eyre, welcome, take a seat. If you haven't read Jane Eyre and you think that you might want to do so in the future, beware that some of this is going to include spoilers. I think that I first read Jane Eyre when I was about 14 years old, and I've reread it a couple of times since then, and every time I reread it I notice something new about it. For those of you asking, because I get asked a lot, my favourite adaptation of Jane Eyre is the BBC miniseries starring Ruth Wilson, because I think she's fantastic. There are so many things that we could sit down and talk about when we're discussing Jane Eyre. We could talk about class and marriage, the Gothic, slavery, colonialism, witchcraft and proto-feminism, as well as many other things. Proto-feminism is the word that we use when we talk about characters or people who are searching for feminist ideals but before the word feminist was coined. But what I'd really like to do today is just to have a really informal chat and pick out certain things about Jane Eyre that I love. I want to talk about the imagery within it and the things that I think make it a really interesting book and one that's great for discussion. The main reading or imagery within Jane Eyre that I find the most compelling is in thinking that Bertha and Jane are mirrors of each other, that they are some way part of a whole. The book opens with Jane reading a book about birds, and she's looking at British birds, but she's also fascinated with exotic birds, with birds of paradise. And Jane is often referred to as a bird throughout the book and is described as quite plain. Bertha, on the other hand, is seen as exotic, and Mr. Rochester says that she was once very, very beautiful. So Bertha and Jane are two opposites here, two completely different types of women, two different kinds of birds who both want to fly away. And Jane also reads Gulliver's Travels and is mesmerised by the people from far-flung places. Jane herself is an outsider. She's an orphan who's been flung into this household full of people who do not love her, yet she is told that she should be grateful. She is specifically told that it's her place to be humble and that she should try to be useful and pleasant. Bertha is also an outsider, married in Jamaica and moved to the UK to a man who no longer loves her anymore, locked up in a tower and told that she must contain herself and behave. Bertha's characteristics of the other as a non-white woman marrying an Englishman embodies the mad woman in the attic characteristics of hysterical women in Victorian times. Rochester tells Jane that Bertha had unhealthy indulgences, so we see her as this sexualized, crazed being. All of the unladylike and undesirable characteristics of a wife are thrust onto Bertha. She is seen as this witch-like person who plays with fire and needs to be shunned. However, though, it's not just Bertha who has these moments. Jane herself has her Bertha moments. At the beginning of the novel, when she stands up to her abusive cousin, she is thrown into what is called the Red Room. And when she's locked within this room, she starts to feel as though she's losing her mind and begins to see spirits, again evoking this sense of witchcraft, and witchcraft being linked with women. The red colour of the Red Room isn't just a reflection of red as being the colour of rage, but also of menstruation. It's as though Jane has been thrust into this large version of a womb to contain her femininity so that it can't leak out and poison the world. The difference here between Jane and Bertha being that Jane gets to be let out again. This imagery of women and witchcraft persists throughout the book, and we see it in many different forms, and one of them that's quite fun is that it is shown in the names of the characters themselves. We see elements of the world like a pagan type tradition, you know, air, earth, water and fire. So we've got Jane Eyre, we've got Helen Burns, we have Grace Poole and St. John Rivers. Jane goes off to her horrible, horrible school where she meets Helen Burns, and Helen exists as a counterpart to Bertha. She is this pious version of innocence, almost like Jane has an angel and a devil sitting on her shoulder throughout the book. So we have Helen and we have Bertha, and each are whispering things to her. Both Helen and Bertha are hyperbolic characters. They're unrealistic and they can't survive. Helen Burns must burn the same way that Bertha must burn, except that Helen dies in this martyr-type Jesus death, and Bertha dies in this version of hellfire, and both die to pave the way for Jane. Jane is a byproduct of both women, and if we're talking about names and symbolism, then Bertha's name is important too, because Bertha Mason is the French word for house, Bertha is contained. What I find quite interesting about the characters in this book is that they realise their sense of performance. It's almost like they know that they're putting on a show for the reader, and this can be seen initially in the fact that Jane Eyre is apparently writing her life for the reader. She addresses the reader. She knows that she is writing for an audience, and therefore she is aware of everything that she is saying. But aside from that, all the characters themselves go through these bouts of performance of gender, performance of class, and this is reflected in lots of the goings-on that happen throughout the novel too. Jane, being obsessed with the Gothic, she paints a lot of Gothic images herself, and she kind of wants to bring those to life. She also, as a writer within her own book, evokes a lot of pathetic fallacy, so whether to reflect the feelings of the characters at the time. There's lots of storms going on during dramatic moments and things like that. There are lots of other instances of characters playing roles. Mr. Rochester dresses up as a traveller, which mixes class and both gender and blends those things. The characters also dress up to play charades, and Mr. Rochester again is playing many different roles. He's pretending he is not married, he pretends to Blanche that he doesn't have as much money to see if she really loves him, and he's also looking after Adele, playing the role of her guardian, despite the fact that he's probably not her father. And to go along with all of this imagery of performance which the characters seem to be quite acutely aware of, we have lots of imagery to do with curtains, visual imagery of breaking down that fourth wall. So we open with Jane hiding behind a curtain. She's trying to escape from her cousins, and we see Mr. Rochester when he is spying on his French mistress who he thinks is cheating on him. He's hiding behind a curtain looking on her, and then Bertha in turn spies on Jane and Rochester behind curtains before setting fire to the curtains that surround Mr. Rochester's bed. That element of performance is taken one step further again when Mr. Rochester and other characters in the book start referring to other performances. So for instance, there's quite a lot of references to Shakespeare. Mr. Rochester starts calling Jane his mustard seed, who is a fairy within the play of A Midsummer Night's Dream, a play that's all about mistaken identity and falling in love with the wrong person. Mr. Rochester continually refers to Jane as pixie-like or fairy-like, again going back to that sense of women being tied up with witchcraft and magic. Rochester also refers to Thornfield and links it with Macbeth at various points throughout the book, which of course would make Bertha Lady Macbeth, a woman who's roaming the corridors at night, wringing her hands and going out of her mind. And when Bertha attacks her brother, Mr. Rochester jokes, "Oh, don't worry, it's just a rehearsal for Much Ado About Nothing." This plays too on mistaken identity, a trope that is rife in Shakespeare plays, both in the comedies and the tragedies, and this novel draws from both. So you have Mr. Rochester dressed up as a travelling woman to see if people can guess who he is, and then Jane says to Mr. Rochester at some point, "Your bride stands between us." And she's not talking about Bertha, because she doesn't know about Bertha, she's talking about Blanche. But little does she know, she's actually right in what she's saying. She's just got the wrong person. And then also, with regard to performance, we have performative gender too. Often when Jane is talking to Rochester, she asserts herself so that she can be more manly. And the language that Charlotte Bronte uses is really interesting. So when she's talking to Mr. Rochester, she uses words like, "I stand erect," and also "I ejaculated." Like, those words are chosen very, very carefully. This performance isn't just relevant to a discussion on what it means to be a woman or a husband or a governess, but also interesting language used when we discuss skin colour in this novel. What we expect of certain characters from their other descriptions in other places throughout the book isn't always lined up. It doesn't always match up entirely. So for instance, John Reed, who is Jane's cousin, mocks his mother for her dark skin, which he has apparently inherited. But they appear to be an all-white family. And Blanche Ingram, so named by Charlotte Bronte because Blanche means white, is really only referred to as being dark. She has dark hair, she has oriental eyes. We might expect Jane and Bertha and the characters within this book to be a series of opposites that are clearly defined. So Jane as a white British woman and Bertha as a non-white Creole woman, but that's actually often not the case. And both Jane and Bertha and other characters throughout the book refuse to be defined in this way. Jane does make some self-assured proto-feminist decisions in this book, either due to moral or due to self-respect, or sometimes due to love, but there is a very dark undertone throughout this book. If Bertha is seen as the red side of womanhood, representing sex and feeling and emotion, then we can read it as Bertha having to die in order for Jane to be with Rochester, not just because Bertha represents a marriage, but because Jane has to kill that side of her and has to become submissive to be with Rochester. Previously, before Jane had found out about Bertha, she said to Rochester that if they got married, then she would like to continue to work, to continue to be paid, and to have her stance as an independent woman who is also married to him as an equal. And at the end of the book, Jane returns to Rochester in a position of power. She has inherited money in this ridiculous circumstance where most, if not all, of the men apart from Rochester in the world are apparently called John. And she has inherited this money and therefore has returned to Rochester in a place of power because money equals power. She's not just powerful because she has money, but she's powerful physically because she returns to Rochester and he has been injured in the fire that Bertha died in. He's now blind and he has one hand as well. So he is seen as physically weak, which is not a trope that I particularly like. But throughout the book, Rochester is actually described by various characters as having deformities. This is well before the fire. So after the fire at Thornfield, and as an aside, I do think that Thornfield within itself represents a lot of fairy tale elements. It has a lot of things to do with Bluebeard and also to do with Sleeping Beauty / Briar Rose. Rochester actually says to Jane at one point that she is as fierce and as prickly as a Briar Rose. And when this was written, it was in a time where things like the Grimm's fairy tales had been written down, were now being distributed quite widely. And moving through with this imagery of fairy tale, as I said, after the fire at Thornfield, Rochester decides to move into a house in the middle of the woods. And that is what happens with old women in fairy tales towards the end of their lives. They move into a cottage in the middle of the woods. They are often old, they are often deformed, and Rochester decides that he is going to move into the woods, and he is deformed. So he takes on this characteristic of a woman, and he calls Jane, he sends out for her in a dream. Suddenly he seems to have this almost magic power, again linking witchcraft with women, and Jane hears him and she comes with this money and this power, and suddenly their gender roles are switched. And that is how it can be that Jane can be with Rochester, because their gender roles have switched, because she's suddenly in a position of power, because she has attained not only the equal status that she wanted, but the suggestion of something more than that. However, it does not end like that. There is this subtle darkness that starts creeping in again, because it mentions at the end of the book that Mr. Rochester is getting his sight back. He is getting his strength back. So that is the dark question that hangs over the end of this novel that I find so fascinating. What happens when Mr. Rochester gets his sight back? What happens when he regains his power? Is Jane equal to that? Or is everything broken again? Does she become Bertha? Is it a cycle? Is she a bird locked in a cage? So that is why I find Jane Eyre such a fascinating book to discuss, to think about. I think it's absolutely fantastic. Let me know if you took part in the read along this time, whether it was your first time reading Jane Eyre or your second time. On Monday, I'm going to be uploading a video looking at behind the scenes at Northern Ballet's production of Jane Eyre, which I really hope that you guys are going to like. Even if you think you don't like ballet, please come back on Monday and watch that video. The dancing is amazing and it's so accessible. I'm really excited to tell you guys about it. I'm going to be reading Reader, I Married Him, which is a collection of short stories based on Jane Eyre and edited by Tracy Chevalier, in the not too distant future. If you would like to join in and read that with me, I will leave a link to the book in the description box down below. I was also wondering if you guys would like me to do a video at some point talking about books that have been inspired by Jane Eyre, because there are quite a few of those. In the meantime, I would love to get into a discussion in the comments. Let me know what you think. I hope that you like this video, and I'll speak to you guys very soon. Lots of book shove. Bye.